and that the assassination of an archduke set off a chain reaction that no one wanted. But this is the version of history written for children. It is the version that ignores the cold, hard economics of empire. If you want to understand why millions of men died in the trenches, and why the map of the Middle East looks the way it does today, you have to look past the assassination. You have to look at a map of the world in the year 1900 and find the one thing that terrified the British Empire more than any army or navy. It was not a weapon. It was a train line. This is the story of the Berlin-Baghdad Railway. It is the story of an iron road that promised to connect the heart of Europe to the oil fields of the Middle East and bypass the British chokehold on global trade. It is the story of how the Ottoman Empire tried to escape the financial slavery of London and Paris, only to walk straight into a trap that would destroy it completely. To understand this tragedy, we must first understand the world as it existed at the turn of the 20th century. The British Empire was the undisputed master of the globe. Its power rested on two pillars. The first was the Royal Navy, which controlled every major ocean shipping lane. The second was the Suez Canal in Egypt. The Suez Canal was the lifeline of the empire. It was the only way to quickly reach India, which was the crown jewel of the British system. As long as Britain controlled Suez, they controlled who could trade with the East. If you were a German merchant or a Russian trader and you wanted to send goods to India or China, you had to pass through British checkpoints. You had to play by British rules. But in the heart of Europe, a new power was rising. Germany had unified in 1871 and was becoming an industrial titan. German factories were outproducing British factories. German science was the envy of the world. But Germany had a problem. They had no empire. They had no massive colonies to provide cheap raw materials. And worst of all, they had no navy that could challenge the British. Germany was a giant trapped in the center of Europe, surrounded by enemies and cut off from the global markets by the British fleet. At the same time, to the southeast lay the Ottoman Empire. For centuries, the Ottomans had been a superpower, but by the late 19th century, they were known as the sick man of Europe. The empire was rotting from the inside. They had lost territory in the Balkans. Their army was outdated, but their biggest problem was debt. The Ottoman government was drowning in loans owed to British and French banks. In 1881, the empire had gone bankrupt. To pay back their creditors, they were forced to surrender control of their own economy to an organization called the Ottoman Public Debt Administration. This was a board of European bankers who literally collected the taxes from Ottoman citizens. If a Turkish farmer sold salt or silk or tobacco, the money did not go to the Sultan. It went to a bank vault in London or Paris. The Sultan at the time, Abdulhamid II, was desperate. He knew that his empire was being eaten alive by foreign capital. He needed a way to modernize his country and defend his borders without relying on the very people who were robbing him. He needed infrastructure. He needed a railway that could move troops from Constantinople to the desert frontiers in days rather than months. But he knew that if he asked the British or French to build it, they would just use it to tighten their grip. This is where the interests of Germany and the Ottoman Empire collided in a perfect storm. The German Kaiser Wilhelm II saw an opportunity that would change the balance of power forever. If Germany could build a railway connecting Berlin to Constantinople, and then extend that railway all the way to Baghdad in the Persian Gulf, they could bypass the British Empire entirely. Think about the geometry of this. A train loaded with German steel or chemicals could leave Berlin, travel through Vienna, cross the Balkans, enter Turkey, and travel all the way to the Indian Ocean without ever seeing a British ship. It would create a massive overland trade route that the Royal Navy could not touch. It would unite the industrial power of Germany with the resource wealth of the Middle East. For the Sultan, it was a lifeline. For Germany, it was a path to world power. For Britain, it was a nightmare. Construction began with German financing and German engineers. Deutsche Bank, the massive German financial institution, took the lead. The engineering was a miracle of its time. They had to blast tunnels through the Taurus Mountains and lay tracks across scorching deserts. As the tracks moved east, panic began to set in London. The British strategic planners looked at the map and saw a dagger pointed at the heart of their empire. If the railway was completed, German troops could threaten the Suez Canal. German merchants could flood the markets of India with cheap goods. But there was something else, something even more dangerous than trade: oil. At this time, oil was just beginning to replace coal as the fuel of the Navy. The British had discovered that oil burned hotter and cleaner than coal. It allowed ships to travel faster and stay at sea longer. Admiral Fisher, the head of the Royal Navy, famously said that the fleet must convert to oil to survive. But Britain had no oil on its own island. They relied on supplies from Persia and the United States. Geologists were beginning to realize that the land the Baghdad Railway would cross the territory of Mesopotamia, which we now call Iraq, was sitting on an ocean of oil. The Germans had secured the mineral rights for 20 kilometers on either side of the railway track. This meant that if the train was finished, Germany would control the tap that fueled the future of warfare. They would control the oil that the British Navy needed to survive. The British establishment decided that this railway could not be allowed to reach the sea. They used every weapon in their arsenal to stop it. First, they tried diplomacy. They pressured the Sheikh of Kuwait, a small territory at the end of the line, to sign a secret agreement with Britain. The Sheikh agreed not to lease any land to foreign powers without British permission. This effectively blocked the railway from having a terminal on the Persian Gulf. It was a strategic checkmate that left the railway leading to nowhere. Then they used the press. British newspapers began a propaganda campaign against the Ottoman Empire, calling them barbarians and accusing the Germans of supporting tyranny. They painted the railway not as a trade route, but as a tool of oppression. Finally, they used finance. The City of London, the financial heart of the world, refused to allow any British capital to invest in the project. They tried to starve the railway of cash, but the Germans kept building. By 1914, the rails had reached the mountains of southern Turkey. The project was nearly complete. The threat was becoming real. It is in this context that we must view the outbreak of World War I. The tensions between the great powers were not just about national pride or border disputes in Europe. They were about who would control the economic future of the world. The Triple Entente, the alliance between Britain, France, and Russia, was formed specifically to encircle Germany and stop its expansion. Russia feared the railway would strengthen the Ottomans, whom they wanted to destroy. France feared German economic dominance, and Britain feared for India and Suez. When the war started, the first place the British military looked was not Berlin, it was the Middle East. The tragedy for the Ottoman Empire was that they had tried to use the rivalry between Europe's powers to save themselves, but they ended up being crushed between them. They joined the war on the side of Germany, hoping that a German victory would free them from their debts to Britain and France. They hoped the railway would bring German guns and supplies to help them retake their lost lands in Egypt and the Caucasus. But they had miscalculated the ruthless determination of the British Empire. The British were not fighting just to defeat an army. They were fighting to secure an asset. As soon as the war began, a British expeditionary force was sent to Basra in southern Iraq. Their mission was ostensibly to protect the oil refinery at Abadan, but their real goal was to march north. They were following the path of the unfinished railway. They were moving to secure the oil fields of Mosul and Kirkuk before the Germans could get there. The war in the Middle East was brutal. While the soldiers in Europe died in mud, the soldiers in Mesopotamia died of heat stroke and disease. The British suffered humiliating defeats like the Siege of Kut, where an entire British army was forced to surrender to the Ottomans. But the British had unlimited resources, and the Ottomans were running on empty. The railway that was supposed to save them was not finished. There were gaps in the tracks through the mountains. Supplies from Germany had to be unloaded, carried by truck or camel over the passes, and then reloaded onto trains. This bottleneck strangled the Ottoman war effort. If the railway had been finished 5 years earlier, the war might have ended very differently. The inability to move troops and supplies quickly enough allowed the British to regroup and push eventually capturing Baghdad and Jerusalem. As the war dragged on, the British and French governments met in secret to decide the fate of the Ottoman lands. They didn't wait for the war to end. In 1916, two diplomats named Mark Sykes and François-Georges Picot sat down with a map and a pencil. They drew lines across the Middle East that ignored tribal boundaries, religious sects, and geography. But if you look closely at the Sykes-Picot agreement, you will see that the lines correspond almost perfectly to the proposed route of the Baghdad Railway and the known locations of oil deposits. Britain claimed the southern part of Iraq and the port of Haifa in Palestine. France claimed Syria and Lebanon. They were carving up the carcass of the empire to ensure that no single power could ever threaten their dominance again. The railway that was meant to unite the region became the knife that divided it. The betrayal was total. The Arabs had been promised independence if they revolted against the Ottomans. T.E. Lawrence, known as Lawrence of Arabia, led these revolts, blowing up the very railway lines that the Ottomans relied on. But when the war ended, the Arabs did not get their freedom. They got British and French colonial rule. The Ottoman Empire was dissolved, the Sultan was deposed, the Caliphate was abolished. The debt was not forgiven, it was merely restructured to be paid by the new nations carved out of the empire. The British Empire had succeeded. They had stopped the German threat. They had secured the route to India. And most importantly, they had seized the oil that would power the 20th century. The Berlin-Baghdad Railway was cut into pieces. Different sections were now in Turkey, Syria, and Iraq. It never functioned as the unified trade route it was designed to be. The dream of a Silk Road of steel was dead. The destruction of the Ottoman Empire and the failure of the Baghdad Railway left a vacuum in the Middle East that we are still dealing with today. But the story did not end in 1918. In fact, the ghost of that railway haunted the region for the rest of the 20th century, and it has returned with a vengeance in the 21st. After the First World War, the British and French controlled the Middle East, but they had a problem. They had seized the land and the oil, but they still needed to get that oil to Europe. The Baghdad Railway, which had been the cause of so much fear, was now in their hands, but it was broken. The borders they had drawn created new obstacles. A train traveling from Baghdad to Europe now had to cross 3 different customs borders. It had to deal with 3 different currencies and 3 different colonial administrations. The economic unity of the region was shattered. This was intentional. The colonial powers preferred a divided Middle East that was weak and dependent to a united one that could challenge them. In the years following the war, the British focused on building pipelines rather than railways. Pipelines were easier to control. They didn't carry passengers or ideas-only oil. The Iraq Petroleum Company was formed, which was a consortium of British, French, and American oil giants. They built a pipeline from the oil fields of Kirkuk in Iraq to the Mediterranean coast. This pipeline followed almost the exact same strategic logic as the old railway project, but this time the profits flowed exclusively to the west. The people of the Middle East saw their wealth being pumped out of their ground and sent away, while their own infrastructure remained primitive. The dream of modernization that the Ottoman sultans had envisioned was replaced by a reality of extraction. But the strategic concept of the Baghdad Railway never truly died. The idea of a land bridge connecting Europe and Asia is simply too powerful to ignore. During the Second World War, the railway became a focal point again. Nazi Germany once again looked to the east. Hitler dreamed of accessing the oil of Iraq and the Caucasus. German agents were sent to Iraq to stir up rebellion against the British. They promised to finish what the Kaiser had started. The British once again had to invade Iraq to secure the oil fields and the transport routes. It was history repeating itself almost word for word. The location of the battles changed slightly, but the prize remained the same: control the corridor, control the world. After the Second World War, the British Empire collapsed under the weight of its own debts. The United States stepped in to fill the void. The Americans inherited the British obsession with controlling the Middle East, but they used different tools. Instead of direct colonial rule, they used coups and alliances, but they were just as terrified of a rival power dominating the Eurasian landmass. During the Cold War, the Soviet Union was the new bogeyman. The U.S. feared that Soviet tanks could pour through the same mountain passes that the Baghdad Railway traversed. Turkey became a key NATO ally, not because of its democracy, but because it sat on the most valuable real estate in the world, the choke point between East and West. Now fast forward to the 21st century. The parallels between the era of the Baghdad Railway and our current moment are terrifying. Today we have a new rising industrial power that is challenging the dominant naval empire. China is the new Germany. The United States is the new British Empire, and the Belt and Road Initiative is the new Baghdad Railway. Just like Kaiser Wilhelm, the Chinese leadership realizes that they are vulnerable at sea. The U.S. Navy controls the shipping lanes of the Pacific and the Indian Ocean. In the event of a war, the U.S. could blockade China and starve its economy of energy. So China is building massive infrastructure projects across the Eurasian continent. High-speed rail lines, pipelines, and highways that connect China to Europe and the Middle East overland. Look at the map of the Belt and Road Initiative. It looks almost exactly like the map of the Baghdad Railway, but on a much larger scale. It seeks to bypass the choke points controlled by the American Navy. It seeks to unite the economies of Asia, Europe, and the Middle East into a single trading bloc that excludes the United States. And just like the British in the 1900s, the Americans are panicking. We see the same headlines in the newspapers. They call the Chinese projects debt traps. They accuse China of supporting dictators. They try to block Chinese companies from buying ports and building 5G networks. The language has barely changed in 100 years. The strategic anxiety is identical. The story of the Baghdad Railway teaches us that when a declining empire feels threatened by an infrastructure project that could undermine its hegemony, it will lash out. It will use financial warfare, propaganda, and eventually military force to stop the connection from being made. The Middle East is once again the chessboard where this game is being played. The wars in Iraq and Syria, the tensions in Iran, the instability in Turkey. All of these conflicts happen along the exact same fault lines where the rails were laid a century ago. It is not a coincidence. It is geography. We can look at the tragedy of the Ottoman Empire as a warning. The Ottomans thought they could play the Europeans off against each other. They thought they could take German money to build their country while maintaining their independence. But when you invite a superpower to build your critical infrastructure, you are not just buying steel and concrete, you are importing their geopolitical enemies. You are making your land a target. The train that was supposed to bring prosperity brought ruin. It brought armies that tore the empire apart. Today, many developing nations are facing the same choice the Sultan faced. They are hungry for development. They need bridges and trains and power plants. China offers to build them cheap and fast. The West warns them to stay away. They are caught in the middle of a struggle that is much bigger than them. The lesson of the Baghdad Railway is that infrastructure is never neutral. A road is never just a road. It is a vector of power, and the powers that be will burn the world down before they let their rivals control the flow of trade. As we watch the news today and see the chaos in the Middle East, we often think it is about religion or ancient hatreds, We are told it is a clash of civilizations. But if you dig down through the sand in the history, you hit the rusted iron tracks of a German railway that was never finished. You find the remnants of a business deal that went wrong. You find the proof that the borders of the Middle East were not drawn to create nations. They were drawn to stop a train. The world we live and the wars we fight and the prices we pay at the gas station were all shaped by the failure of the Baghdad Railway. The train that never arrived is still destroying the world.